Hi, welcome to part 2 of our 2018 cruise to the Broughtons. We started week 2 waking up at a beautiful sunny day in Spout Bay on Hansen Island. We needed to make it to Port McNeill to pick up my brother who was going to spend a week with us cruising through the Broughton archipelago. But even though it was a short journey, we still managed to catch a couple of whales on our way. It was starting to look like it was going to be a great trip for whale watching. We spotted 2 in Blackfish Sound. We tied up at Port McNeill, and I arranged to borrow their van so that we could drive out to the Port Hardy airport. And we picked up my brother Doug, who'd flown in from Vancouver on Pacific Coastal. The next day was going to be cold and dreary, so we decided instead of sailing, we'd take a trip over to Alert Bay. We walked on the ferry in the morning and took the short ferry ride over to the island. Alert Bay is home to a whole bunch of Aboriginal artifacts. The first thing we decided to check out was the old cemetery with a mix of both Christian and Aboriginal art. There are some beautiful old totem poles here, and I love the mix of the 2 mythologies. Traditionally, the totem poles are allowed to fall and deteriorate rather than be repaired. Then we headed over to the Umista Center, home of a bunch of recovered Kwakwatl artifacts. You aren't allowed to film in there, so I don't have any shots. There was this one modern mask that I did get a little video of, but suffice it to say, they're quite beautiful. And then it was back to McNeill. The next day we were up bright and early. I'd asked my brother if he wanted to be passenger or crew, and he'd opted to be a passenger. So the first thing I did was put him at the wheel as we headed out. It was a calm day, so there was no sailing to start off with, but we did see a beautiful rainbow as we were leaving. As we crossed the Queen Charlotte Strait, we spotted our first humpback whale. I didn't manage to get any video of them. We also saw a few more Dall's porpoises. It turned out to be a beautiful, stunning day, and my brother had a great introduction to the Broughtons as we moved into the archipelago proper. Today's destination was Pierre's at Echo Bay. There weren't many boats there, so we headed to the back and tied ourselves up. Once we were all settled in, we decided to take a little walk. thought Doug would really enjoy heading over to Billy Proctor's and seeing all the old artifacts that he's collected over the years. So we set up for our first trip through the rainforest. We've been to Billy Proctor's a couple of times, and every time I go I find something new and fascinating. He's collected a lot of things over the years. And then it was back to the boat and a quiet evening. The next morning we got up and walked the dock for a while. It was an extremely low tide, and so we spent some time just looking at all the creatures on the shoreline. This was all new for my brother. He'd never visited the west coast and walked the shorelines before, so we introduced him to most of the creatures that we knew about. And then it was time to go. Pierre's is always a great place to visit, and we hope to be back, but we did find out later that Pierre has put it up for sale. Hopefully he'll still be there for a few more years, but I'm glad that we got the chance to visit. Our next stop was Lacey Falls. We'd always wanted to get a picture of our boat in front of Lacey Falls, but that's kind of hard to do. So they dropped me off the dinghy with a couple of cameras and proceeded to cruise back and forth. I did manage to get a few good shots. Then, because the water's so deep, we managed to get in pretty close to the falls, and everybody gathered on the bow to take some pictures. Even a couple of beautiful barn swallows. We'd heard there'd been a bear wandering along the shore in a nearby bay, so we decided we'd stick our heads in and see if we could spot him. No luck, but it was a really beautiful little place. Once again, I made my brother do all the dirty work and helm us in the tight, narrow bay. Then, just as we were about to head towards Kwatsi Bay, I saw a dolphin off in the distance. So I slowed down, and eventually they headed over towards us and started to ride our bow. It's indescribable how exciting it is to see these beautiful Pacific white-side dolphins as they play alongside the boat. They'll turn over on their sides and peek up at you, and you feel like you're truly interacting with them. One particular dolphin decided he was going to jump over and over and over again to impress us in front of the boat. It was an interesting behavior, and I really enjoyed it. We followed along for about a half an hour, and then we both went our separate ways. We'd radioed ahead, and we knew there was room at the dock at Kwasi Bay for us, so we turned into the bay We tied up at the dock alongside a few familiar faces, a boat that we'd met a couple of days earlier. Then we took the dinghy over to the waterfall and hiked up to see it. It's a short trail and well worth the experience. Something about these rainforests that is just so beautiful. I took some time to do a little bit of close-up work with the camera and record a few memories. Then we headed back to the dock and joined the potluck for that evening. I even managed to convince my brother to join us. I made some fresh focaccia and managed to impress a lot of them. The next morning was more of a misty day, and I took some time to grab the camera and go explore the water underneath the docks. I got some good shots of sea cucumbers, some interesting blue starfish, sea urchins, mussels, and anemones. As you can see, I can spend hours just staring at all the life under the water. Then we took off again. The plan for the day was to try and make it to Potts Lagoon. Pretty soon the wind picked up and we were managing to tack back and forth across the channel, and Doug got his first real experience at sailing. The wind started to build, and it got a little more exciting. But all in all, it was a pretty fun day. Eventually, we rolled the sails in because it was starting to build, and we weren't making much headway. We managed to cross Knight Inlet with no incidents. The winds gusted up to 25, 26 knots, but it wasn't that uncomfortable, and it was only a short distance. And then the wind calmed down. But as soon as we turned up into Clio Channel, the wind started to gusting. We learned something interesting that day. Our dinghy will take flight somewhere around 35, 36 knots wind. It was lifted into the air, flipped upside down, and dove down into the water. We lost our seat, our oar, and our fuel tank. A series of man overboards got our fuel tank and our seat back, but the oar was gone for good. We decided to turn back and head downwind to Lagoon Cove. It was only a couple of miles away and made more sense than bashing our way into these high winds. We took Doug for a walk around Lagoon Cove, explored unique exercise stations, and paused for a swing or two. Lagoon Cove was having their traditional prawn happy hour, but we decided to stay in and relax after a pretty busy day. The next morning was a beautiful sunny day. Another really low tide, but we didn't spend too much time exploring the shoreline. Then we headed off down Night Inlet again, on our way to Village Island. They've built these beautiful new docks. Apparently they're going to set up some permanent operation there. But when we arrived, the docks were still closed off, and there was no one to be found. So we tied up to the shoreline and headed towards the village itself. Village Island is home to an old abandoned native village. There's not much there. Some old buildings, posts from an old longhouse, and the remains of an old wolf totem. We'd been there in 2015, and it had been more distinct and easier to see. But it was almost completely back to nature by now. We spent some time wandering up and down the Midden Beach, picking up shells, pieces of glass, and shards of old pottery. This is the site of the last official potlatch that had happened in Canada before they had been banned in the early part of the 20th century. Many of the pieces of regalia that we'd seen over at Alert Bay came from this island. I also spotted this lovely butterfly and tried out my slow-mo again. Much of the island is covered in blackberry bushes. Most of it was cut back now. After a couple of hours exploring, we got back in the boat and headed over to the Goat Islet anchorage. There were already 3 or 4 boats there, but we tucked in and found a spot not too far from shore. And then I made pizza. It's one of our boat specialties. Beautiful sunny evening. We sat in the cockpit, enjoyed our pizza, some red wine, and talked over the day. We decided to stay put for a day, and so loaded everybody into the dinghy and went for a bit of an explore. A few miles away there's a thing called the Chief's Bathtub. It's some ancient hieroglyphics in a spot where the water collects at high tide. Legend is chiefs had to spend a day there in the cold water. And then we spent some time exploring the shorelines. I tried to do some stabilizing on this video, and that's why these interesting creatures were dancing around. Turns out my brother was just as interested in staring underneath the water as we were. We spent most of the rest of the day just going from spot to spot, looking at tiny creatures, crabs, and rock formations. was having some trouble that day with my on-off switch on my GoPro knockoff, and so I had a couple hours of video of it sitting on the bottom of the boat. We also found these interesting shrimp, and I haven't actually managed to find out what they are. We'd never seen sea urchins before, but this trip, everywhere we went, we found red ones and green ones. To finish the day off, we headed back to the anchorage and took a little walk along the shoreline and explored some of the forest. This island had been clear-cut at one time, but unlike Alberta, it comes back pretty vigorously. The next morning was simply beautiful. There was a slight mist, the sun was low, the water was glassy, and it was just idyllic. But unfortunately, we had to go. So we pulled anchor and headed out into the beautiful morning, retracing our steps that we'd done on the dinghy the day before. As we hit Blackfish Sound, we saw a couple more whales. At first we thought we'd seen a minke, but then we realized no, we were seeing our first humpback calf. I didn't manage to get any video of the young one. We spent 20 or 30 minutes or so in Blackfish Sound floating around, watching mom and baby swim back and forth. Across from Malcolm Island, we spotted our first minke whales. There were two of them, and they were hard to get a video of, but I managed to get a shot of this one. We knew he was a minke because of the distinctive dorsal fin. Back at Port McNeill, we fueled up. They have a great system there where they bring the hose to you. And then once again we borrowed the van, but there were 3 different groups of sailors that were needed to do pickups or drop-offs, so they drove us out to the airport. Well, that's it for week 2 of our trip to the Broughtons. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for part 3.